Mapping the giant, 4 basins, 1 fragile system. To see what failed on that red plain, we need to zoom out, not to a single blue blob on a map, but to a layered machine spread under a fifth of a continent. Think of the Great Artesian Basin as stacked sandstone highways with toll gates you can't see. Between them, siltstone and mudstone that seal, slow, and sometimes leak. Water moves, but it moves like a glacier, centuries for a short trip, millennia for a long one. When a gauge twitches, it's reacting to a pressure story written far away and long ago. From the air, it looks like one system. Underground, it behaves like 4. The Western, the Eastern, the Surat, and the Carpentaria arcs aren't separate countries, but they speak different dialects. Each has its own potentiometric head, its baseline pressure, and its own memory of waste, drilling, and drought. This is the first trap. Treating the whole like one tank and assuming a win in one corner balances a loss in another. In the Western Basin, pressure still sits high in places, big distances, fewer bores, but the history of free-flow channels left scars that never fully healed. Springs at the margins carry the memory. When they thin, it's a letter arriving late from decades of overflow. A property caps 3 legacy bores and watches a gauge climb a few meters, 30 kilometers down gradient. A spring brightens just enough to be noticed, then steadies. The rebound is real and slow. The lag can lull you into thinking the job is done. Swing east and the mosaic tightens. The Eastern Arc hosts more towns, more stations, more overlapping claims on the same head. Here, capping programs turned open drains into pipelines and troughs, saving millions of liters that once steamed away under hard sun. Some lines on the pressure map softened from red to amber. Yet even in those success stories, a cluster of new straws a few ridgelines over pulled the recovery flat. The basin answered, but the demands talked over it. The Surat, down in Queensland and into New South Wales, is where energy stepped onto the stage. Coal seam gas fields need to depressurize coal to free methane, and that means moving water. Licenses draw bright boundaries, but the aquifer doesn't read them. Produced water is treated, redirected, sometimes re-injected, sometimes stored. On paper, impacts look localized. On the ground, gauges near extraction clusters show dips out of step with neighbors. Farmers in that belt learned a new language: connectivity, confining layers, vertical leakage. They shouldn't have had to. Meanwhile, the Carpentaria Edge holds quiet complexities, thin aquifers, patchy recharge windows, long pathways to the outlets. One misjudged bore can echo wider than anyone expects. A driller hits a screen with a little more flow than budgeted, and a year later, a springline size. Nobody links the two at first because the distance hides the cause. Then a scientist arrives with isotopes and a timeline that joins the dots. The answer lands. The system listened. Here's where the word renewable breaks. Yes, rain hits the recharge zones where sandstones are exposed along the eastern uplands. Yes, some of that water percolates down, but the raindrop to bore journey is long enough that your great-grandchildren won't taste it. Renewable in the legal sense, maybe. Renewable in the human planning sense, not at industrial rates, not on investment horizons that count in election cycles and loan terms. Now layer on the asymmetry. Extraction isn't evenly spread, it bunches. Booming districts, feedlots, processing hubs, gas fields, stack straws where recharge is thinnest or slowest. Pressure isn't a polite average, it's a neighborhood effect. One busy block can tip the street. A town that metered and cut its losses finds its gains cancelled by a license granted 2 shires away. People feel punished for doing the right thing, and trust thins with the head. Travel time matters. Old surveys tucked away in filing cabinets told a story that feels cruel in hindsight. Some flow lines from the recharge shoulder to the far west springs take thousands to millions of years. What that means on the ground is this: when a bore stops flowing, there can still be water in the rock, but the pressure fell below the threshold that pushes it to daylight. Pumps can lift what pressure can't, at a price that pulls margins inside out. A flowing bore is a gift of physics, a pumped one is a bill. The map's final lesson lands like a sigh. You can't average your way out of a local crisis. Basin-wide graphs can rise while a district fails. Capping can win on Monday. A cluster of new withdrawals can claw it back by Friday. The only math that matters is sub-basin by sub-basin, with eyes on the confining layers and ears tuned to the springs. It isn't one tank. It's a fragile network of connected vessels, and it was never designed to carry the weight we piled on it. Everything was about to change when a new industry punched fresh holes. But even without them, the old wounds still bled. The energy complication, gas, mines, and the water ledger. While Capping trimmed the old waste, a new player walked on stage carrying permits and drill strings. In the Surat, coal seam gas crews set their rigs not to chase water, but methane locked in coal. To free the gas, they had to lower the pressure in the coal seams. Lowering pressure means moving water, produced water, out of the way. On paper, it's temporary. In practice, the aquifer above and below has to absorb the change. Here's what that looked like on a Tuesday morning. A grazier near Chinchilla watched a service ute bounce along a fence line toward a wellhead that wasn't his. The crew opened a valve, the gauge dipped. Nothing dramatic, just a few meters. A week later, his own bore read a fraction lower than it had in months. He called the company. They pointed to a license that said impacts would be localized and minor. He looked at his cattle and thought minor wasn't the word. Produced water didn't vanish. It had to go somewhere. Tanks rose on pads, then pipelines carried brackish flows to treatment plants where reverse osmosis turned salt into concentrate and clean water into a new question: release, store, or re-inject. Re-injection sounded like balance, put it back where it came from. Only the where was a layer cake. Push too hard into a confining bed and you risk fractures. Miss a seal and you create a shortcut between aquifers that never meant to talk. Engineers were careful, geology was stubborn. Meanwhile, open-cut mines dewatered pits to keep trucks rolling. Pits don't respect neat hydrostratigraphic diagrams, they invite the surrounding groundwater to flow toward a hole. Pumps kept up, and the drawdown cone spread like a bruise under the lease. Temporary, the approvals said. Recoverable, maybe for saturated sands nearby. But for artesian head already under stress, another straw was another subtraction. The spreadsheets captured volumes. The springs captured consequences. Licensing frameworks tried to police the borders. One permit in the Walloon coal measures, another in the Hutton sandstone, a monitoring bore here, a trigger threshold there. But the rock layers aren't hard partitions. They're stitched with faults, ancient channels, and variable seals. Connectivity is a spectrum, not a switch. A company could keep within its numbers and still nudge a neighbor's gauge. Regulators asked for models. Consultants delivered them with confidence intervals wide enough to drive a road train through. Case evidence piled up in the margins. A cluster of gas wells brought a gentle but persistent dip in nearby observation bores tapping shallower units. A mine's ramp-up coincided with a spring's discharge tapering beyond natural variability. Coincidence? One report asked. Cumulative effects? A hydrologist answered, circling 4 signatures that made more sense together than apart. The trade-off math was blunt. Royalties today against water security on a clock you can't reset. Jobs on a 5-year horizon against pressure that took millennia to build and can fail in a decade if pushed. Towns like the cash injections, the full motels, the new utes at the servo. They also liked taps that ran without diesel. The ledger didn't balance neatly. It rarely does when one commodity is ancient pressure and the other is quarterly earnings. What nobody knew at the time, or admitted out loud, was how small the safety margin had become in certain districts. Capping had given back some head. Then dozens of gas wells quietly asked for a slice of that gain to free their methane. Mines, already permitted, leaned on the same head to keep their voids dry. Each claim was rational. Together, they were a crowd on a weak bridge. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Farmers who'd converted to pipelines and float valves felt like suckers when their gauges drifted anyway. Trust, like pressure, is hard to build and easy to lose. Community meetings turned tense. Company reps pointed to dashboards and thresholds. Locals held up dog-eared logs showing the day the bore stopped singing. "Your model says stable," a woman said. "My trough says otherwise." The energy sector did put water back on the table, ironically, by making it visible. Produced water volumes, salinity profiles, storage risks, all forced into the open. That transparency helped, but it also revealed how many black boxes remained. Proprietary data fenced off key wells. State lines sliced the map into jurisdictions that didn't compare notes often enough. The basin didn't care about boundaries. The pressure didn't either. Then came a heatwave summer. Demand for power spiked, and generators leaned on supply from gas. Upstream, the wells had to keep flowing. Downstream, a town announced emergency water restrictions after a pair of monitoring bores tripped alarms. Unrelated, the statement said, maybe connected by subtle pathways the approvals never priced and the models underplayed. Impact, immediate, localized dips that turned flowing bores into borderline cases. Ripple effects, operators trucking water farther, pumps working harder, springs inching toward thresholds where invertebrates that survived dry centuries couldn't handle one more quiet season. Long arc, a policy lesson written in sandstone. You can't mine pressure twice, once for gas, once for water, and pretend the ledger will forgive you. Even if you stop new holes tomorrow, the old wounds still bleed. The physics has a long memory and an unforgiving bill cycle. The Great Waste, free-flow bores and evaporations tax. Before gas rigs and mine pits complicated the ledger, the simplest wound was the loudest. Free-flow bores running day and night into open drains. You could hear them from a ridge, the steady hiss that felt like prosperity. Water spilled into trenches, wandered across paddocks, and evaporated under a hard sky. It looked generous. It was loss at industrial scale. Here's a day in that era. A boundary rider follows a channel that never should have existed, banks slumped, rushes thick, dragonflies hovering over a ribbon of water laid on by geology, not a river. The trough at the end overflows, so someone digs a little deeper to catch the excess. The sun does the rest. Millions of liters turn to air before a single beast drinks. Nobody writes a bill for the head of pressure that disappears with the shimmer. Waste-embedded habits. If the bore runs for free, you run it. If the drain goes dry, you dig it wider. Every new gate and wing fence assumed the hiss wouldn't stop. The sound trained people to be careless. You didn't need float valves when the trench filled itself. You didn't need to count stock at a trough when a channel could flood the whole flat. Livestock walked farther and muddied the edges. Weeds took root. Salinity rose where the water lingered too long. The land learned to live with a leak. Then the fixes arrived, slow, expensive, and effective where they were allowed to do their job. Capping programs sent crews from property to property, setting steel, welding flanges, threading valves. Open drains became buried pipelines snaking to troughs fitted with floats that shut water off when full. The first time a grazier watched a trough stop clean instead of spilling over, he nodded like he'd been waiting 20 years to see common sense. Down gradient, a spring brightened. A pressure gauge 3 stations away twitched up a meter, then 2, holding through summer. People kept quiet about it in case the hope was fragile. But common sense cost money. Some bores were so old their casings crumbled when touched. The quote to rehabilitate would make a stoic swear. Who pays? A government grant covered part, but not the whole. A family with a thin year banked the check and postponed the work. The most wasteful bores were often the hardest to fix because they'd been leaking longest, wearing out everything around them. Meanwhile, the drain kept steaming. Engineering answers ran into social inertia. A neighbor capped and piped, only to see his upstream mate let water run because that's how Dad did it. The upstream mate wasn't stubborn for sport. He was broke or suspicious of paperwork or tired of inspectors who came once and never returned. Meetings filled with maps and promises, then people went home to pumps that rattled and drains that sparkled in moonlight. You can't shame a man into spending money he doesn't have, and you can't fix a system with half measures stretched across 1,000 kilometers. Quantify the waste and the numbers get ugly fast. Take a free-flow bore at 20 liters a second into an open channel. That's 1.7 million liters a day laid bare to a desert sun that can take a third before stock touch a trough. Multiply by months, years, decades, and translate into calves that didn't make sail weight, diesel burn to truck water when the channel slumped, springs that went quiet because head leaked off upstream. Put dollars on it, and you see balance sheets sag. Put lives on it, and you see choices turn cruel. Still, the capping stories matter. In districts where capping went all in, no half measures, no grandfathered losses, pressure stabilized. Springs that had dwindled to a whisper found a voice. People stopped fighting mud and started managing valves. The land healed in ways that felt like a memory returning. But every success needed trust. Trust that if you fixed your leak, the neighbor would fix his. That if you shared data, it would be used to help, not punish. That if you invested now, someone wouldn't approve a new drain by another name next door. Here's the catch: fixes without trust stall, trust without data breaks, and data without enforcement drifts. The waste taught all three lessons at once. The evaporation tax was never just physics. It was the cost of delay, spread thin enough to ignore until the day a bore coughed and stopped, and the silence finally carried the bill. The data problem, what nobody's measuring. Fixes need trust, and trust needs proof. Here's the catch: too many decisions ride on guesses dressed up as certainty. Pressure gauges blink like Christmas lights in some districts and stay dark in others. A spring goes quiet, and nobody can say whether it was a hot summer, an upstream leak, or a coal seam gas ramp-up. People argue in meetings with numbers written on napkins because the official dashboards don't show their paddock, yet every invoice and every risk premium does. Patchy monitoring is the first pothole. Some sub-basins have dense networks of observation bores. Others have a handful placed decades ago, read quarterly, then averaged until the life is squeezed out of the story. Salinity, sometimes. Temperature, rarely. Vertical gradients across confining layers, almost never, and that's the measurement that tells you if the seal is holding or if a slow leak is stealing head. Without that, a model is guessing the strength of a dam without checking for hairline cracks. Then there's the black box of proprietary wells. Private operators, pastoral mining, gas collect terabytes, downhole pressure, flow, chemistry, temperature logs, quarter-hourly. Those data sit on servers behind non-disclosure clauses. The basin lives with the consequences. The basin can't see the patterns. A company might share a trend line with smoothing set to reassure. Locals want the raw feed, the spiky truth that matches the day the trough sputtered at dawn and the moment the spring fell quiet. Model uncertainty isn't a footnote, it's the plot. Recharge estimates for key exposure zones vary by orders of magnitude depending on method, period, and assumptions about vegetation and soil. Change the leaf area index in a model, and you can move a minister's confidence by 1 billion liters. Meanwhile, the raindrop doesn't care. It takes the path it takes, and that path could be 90 years or 9,000. If your policy horizon is 4 years, both look like later. That's how later becomes too late. What nobody measured carefully for decades were the lags. Pressure decline is not a light switch. You can cap a wasteful bore and watch nothing change for a year, then see a spring brighten in year 3. A gas field can hold steady for a season, then a gentle sag appears in an observation bore a valley over. Without high-frequency, long-term, multi-depth data, the cause and effect chain looks like coincidence. That's where denial lives, between the event and the consequence, where hope outtalks physics. Here's where it gets practical. Satellites can already see the ground swell and sink by millimeters as aquifers breathe. Tie that INSAR to a web of pressure transducers, and you start to read the system's pulse. Fiber optic cables in monitoring wells turn the water column into a thermometer, spotting subtle temperature shifts that reveal vertical leakage through confining layers. Isotopes, tritium, carbon-14, chlorine-36, tag the age of water, separating last-century recharge from Pleistocene stock. Put those tools together and maybe turns into there. But tech without access is theater. The data commons has to be real. Meter every licensed extraction over a threshold, stream anonymized rates in real time, publish bore chemistry quarterly, and log pressures at multiple depths in shared aquifers. No more PDFs uploaded 6 months late. No more maps without scales. A grazier should be able to open a phone and see the head at the boundary bore, the trend for the sub-basin, and any alerts tied to thresholds agreed in daylight. There's a fear baked into sharing that truth will be used as a weapon. A station shows a spike in extraction during a heat wave and worries a regulator will arrive with a fine instead of a fix. A company logs a localized dip and fears headlines. Shift the incentive. Make disclosure the condition for certainty, insurance discounts, access to capping funds, fast-track approvals only if your gauges talk. Silence costs. Honesty buys resilience. Meanwhile, something else has to change. The unit of decision. Basin-wide averages soothe. Sub-basin thresholds save. Set pressure floors that matter ecologically, springs alive, not just wet, then tie triggers to actions that are automatic, not negotiable. If the head at a sentinel bore dips below X for Y weeks, extractions in the red zone ratchet down Z%. People can plan around rules that move on measurements. They can't plan around hope. A detail buried in old surveys said it plainly. In some flow paths, the travel time is longer than the modern economy. That's not doom, it's calibration. Measure the system properly and you can buy time where it counts, retire losses where it doesn't, and stop mistaking noise for recovery. The basin is speaking. It's been speaking for a century. We just didn't put enough microphones in the right places. The timeline: how fast does ancient water run out? To see the clock, lay 3 futures side by side. In the first, we keep doing what we've done: cap where it's convenient, approve extractions with comfort clauses, argue over models while gauges slide. In the second, we go hard on waste: mandatory capping, tight metering, real triggers tied to real thresholds. In the third, we hit the brakes where pressures are already brittle, pause new withdrawals in red zones, retire the worst bores, and force the ledger to heal before it breaks. Stakes first: a flowing bore isn't about volume, it's about head. Once pressure drops below a threshold, flow stops even with water in the rock. That's the cliff. Below it, pumps take over, costs climb, and some springs die because they can't drink electricity. People feel the difference as minutes at a tap and dollars at month's end. The basin feels it as silence. Action Scenario 1: the status quo. Waste declines continue where grants reach, but extraction clusters grow faster than savings. Energy keeps drawing under localized impact clauses. Towns delay pump retrofits another year. Pressure drifts down a meter here, half a meter there. A handful of sub-basins cross the no-flow line at sentinel bores within a decade. Bores that ran for generations switch to intermittent. Springs at the margins that were barely holding wink out during a dry summer and don't return the next wet. The ledger pretends it's stable because averages look polite. The ground disagrees. Impact immediate: more diesel, deeper screens, a trickle of destocking decisions that turns into a trend. Ripple effects: banks start asking for pressure histories with loan applications. Insurers add a water risk rider. A meatworks misses 3 loading windows in a quarter and quietly cuts a shift. The status quo buys time on paper and sells it in the paddock. Scenario 2: aggressive capping and transparent metering. Take every open drain and bury it. Fit floats on every trough above a threshold. Link funding to live data, no dollars. Within 2 to 4 years, sub-basin pressure lines flatten in districts that used to leak like sieves. Springs brighten where connectivity favors quick wins. A grazier watches a gauge rise a meter and finally believes the program. Trust returns in patches.